Well, I want to welcome everyone and thank Joshua Broder, who's CEO of Tilson, for leading this discussion for us today of how to promote broadband through federal grant programs that have come out of the COVID and CARES legislation. As a quick introduction before Joshua gives his view on the best way to combine existing programs and new programs to get the biggest broadband deployment that our nation so desperately needs as we come out of COVID and into recovery. But Joshua, under his leadership, has grown Tilson from less than 10 employees to more than 500 in 20 locations. He founded Tilson's public utility affiliate, which owns 5G infrastructure, including poles, towers, dark fiber, and neutral host indoor and outdoor wireless networks nationwide. Josh cut his teeth in leadership as an Army signal officer on missions in Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia, where he was awarded the Bronze Star for service in Afghanistan, designing, building, and operating communication networks for U.S. forces. Josh holds a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College and is a graduate of AT&T's Operation Hand Salute at JFK University with a certificate in entrepreneurial studies. He is currently serving on the gubernatorial appointment as a co-chair of Maine's Economic Recovery Committee. Josh, we look forward to your comments and remarks, and then a brief time of question and answer at the close of your remarks. So today, thank you, Josh.
Thanks for having me on, Chip, and kudos to the entire INCOMPAS team on a strong virtual policy summit this year. And it's such a critical year for adaptation and recovery from the pandemic. Federal block grants provided to the states have proven to be a fast and effective means to promote and deliver universal broadband. Many states use CARES Act funding to rapidly deploy broadband in response to the pandemic, which provided a trial for this approach of federal block grants. I lead a company, Tilson, that advised state governments on their CARES Act broadband programs, designed and built networks for grant recipients, and was itself a grant recipient and an ISP. I'd like to share what we learned through this process and provide some recommendations about the advantages of using the federal block grant approach to fund broadband networks and how to communicate about it in your advocacy work. Prior to the pandemic, the policy consensus was that expanding broadband coverage to rural areas is best done through established and sometimes monolithic programs like CAF2, RDOF, and Reconnect. These programs are administered by federal agencies with highly specialized professional programmatic staff in places like the FCC and the USDA. These are big, complex programs with a standardized application process applied uniformly across the entire country. Big players, big carriers tend to be more successful in these programs as they can bear the overhead to apply past the literal application requirements like strong balance sheets and can meet the programmatic requirements on an ongoing basis. And ILECs have been most successful at winning awards and deploying funds in those programs to make broadband connections. As a result of these programs, the federal government's been able to get broadband to a lot of people. These programs are slow to deploy. They do a good job preventing fraud, waste, and abuse, and they're reliant on centralized federal mapping data with known issues, leaving some premises behind and duplicating coverage in others. And these programs have ensured that broadband meets some minimum standards, including the low federal speed threshold, but generally not achieving highly aspirational speeds on a national or globally competitive basis, with a notable exception of RDOF, which rewards gigabit speeds. So I think these are good programs and they should be sustained. The CARES Act provided for an experiment on some alternative approaches. State utilized flexible coronavirus relief fund, or the CRF, that was provided by the CARES Act, and rural states benefited from a minimum threshold allocation in this fund to each state of $1.25 billion. While larger states got some larger awards, the minimum threshold provided more per capita funding to those rural states, and those rural states, of course, are where there's a higher number of unserved premises relative to the population. These funds were available to the states on a broadly discretional basis, which responded to the effects of the pandemic. And limited access to school, healthcare, and remote work have been widely felt symptoms of the pandemic, and many states saw the CRF as a tool to help solve those problems. The CRF really wasn't intended to be a broadband program, but states had problems that they couldn't solve, like kids not being able to get to school, and they knew they could solve those problems with better broadband. Instead of monolithic federal programs, these funds were flexible with state-driven uses, and the main constraints of these funds were that they needed to be used for expenses that were, I'll read right from the bill here, necessary expenditures incurred due to the public health emergency with respect to the coronavirus disease, and that were incurred during the period that began March 1st, 2020, and ended in December 30th, 2020. These funds have subsequently been extended. According to a Pew Research Center study, 20 states created new programs or expanded existing ones with these funds to support specifically digital learning, telehealth, public Wi-Fi, and residential broadband infrastructure. And the December 30th deadline led to quick, targeted projects with necessarily minimal administrative overhead because of the time constraints. The program had features that the policy consensus would say were generally bad in a program. They were truncated application reviews. There was low project oversight, lack of long-term controls and reporting and audit, disaggregated data, unforgiving timelines, lack of uniformity in the mission, the criteria, and the application type. But what these funds did do is they devolved decision-making to states using their local knowledge and mapping data, and proposals from providers with experience in local markets that could mobilize quickly and make targeted investments based on known needs tended to win grants quickly. And while there was some overlap in providers, in general, the state level applicants were different kinds of broadband providers and ISPs than some of the federal program winners. More evaluation of these programs and the results will be helpful in retrospect, but I'm going to share some of Tilson's experiences and what they suggest about how this might inform the approach going forward. And not to hide the ball here, I think we should look closely at similar block grants in any future federal broadband funding. The best way to talk about the impact of this approach is to storytell about the projects themselves. And here are 3 specific examples of local manifestations of these block grants from my perspective. And on its face, there just wasn't enough time under the statute to do any new infrastructure deployment, but a lot of infrastructure got deployed as a result of these programs because local projects will often find a way. The first one I want to highlight is the Connecting New Hampshire Emergency Broadband Expansion Program, which provided $50 million for local broadband flex grants. And the New Hampshire Electrical Cooperative, a member-owned power company, applied for one of these grants and was awarded $6.7 million to deploy in 4 towns enrolled in New Hampshire: Colebrook, Stewartstown, Clarksville, and Leominster. And the NHEC said they would deploy fiber to the home to 900 unserved members with this money. And you get a sense of that ticket, $6.7 million to 900 unserved members is a really rural territory, deploying 100 miles of OSP in 100 days. And they did. Our role in this project was the design engineering and the build out of the network electronics. And the key innovations that we saw at the local level in this project were that we were able to get expedited make ready in partnership with a cooperative who was building on their own account. And the make ready was really only performed if it was needed to comply with PUC rules, NASC code, joint use agreements, and attachment agreements, or to address a specific safety concern. And we were able to use temporary fiber attachments that were needed to hit our deadlines, like bracket arms and lowest position on the pole. And pole replacements were generally avoided or deferred to the month after the grant deadline where it was safe to do so. Another manifestation of this grant program was in the city of Tucson, which received a $4 million grant from the state of Arizona to build a modern wireless network using freely available CBRS spectrum, and is currently distributing 5,000 in-home cellular and Wi-Fi hotspots that connect to the network to provide a borderless classroom to students who can't be in school in person and lack access to high-speed broadband. And our role in this project was the local deployment partner to get these systems onto towers and turned up. And this required the rapid formation of a vendor ecosystem to leverage a new technology and spectrum, which hadn't been done in very many places, leading to some durable partnerships and teams that are now replicating this project in communities across the country, where students can't get to school. This also required the procurement, configuration, and distribution of 5,000 in-home devices, which was really a new function for city government, and really forcing a city to think like a carrier, and perhaps come up with new operating models. And it also drove good thinking on the evolution of network in real time to build a low-cost roadmap from LTE to 5G as the network demands increase. The final example I want to highlight is in Vermont. In Vermont's COVID-19 Emergency Connectivity Initiative provided $3.7 million grant to serve 3 towns in northeastern Vermont, Danville, St. Johnsbury, and Lunenburg, across some really rugged terrain and difficult make-ready environment. I'm talking about pole lines through the woods off-road in the middle of the winter up in the North Country. And our role in this case was as the grant applicant and recipient, the design builder, and the ISP that is now providing services in those communities. And I think we're serving, on this initial implementation, about 600 customers. And this project has been really about partnerships and good data, which are great examples of what happens on these local projects. Tilson's partnered with the Vermont Electrical Cooperative, which is a local electric transmission company, to swap dark fiber to reduce overbuild and improve the reach of both of our company's networks. We've partnered with Green Mountain Power, which is the local electric distribution company. They purchased the ILEC portion of their joint use poles, so now they're the sole pole owner, would put them in a position to really expedite make ready during the project. And really importantly, and I think this is a feature of many of the state programs we saw in the 9 or 10 states that we worked in these projects with, is that the state had address level data of which premises were unserved or had limited service and at what level. And they used this data to identify priority locations for the use of grant funds. And so the state used actual address level analysis and scoring of the grant applications. And this permitted Tilson to develop a targeted network design to support each grant application, then gave the state faith that the money was being used specifically and actively to target homes that were unserved. So at Tilson, we've had to look at and comment on a number of proposed new federal broadband bills, and we love tailored, technically detailed programs like what we've seen in those bills. Those are the kind of roles that are really helpful in getting a targeted policy outcome and are what we often build for our state government consulting clients. But in the context of COVID-19 relief, each of these requirements is its own poison pill that will prevent the distribution of funds and the construction of infrastructure as grantees try and comply with them. And so even the limited requirements of the CARES Act, which really had nothing specific to say about broadband, were nearly crippling in some states. States are by nature risk adverse and want to be sure to comply with every jot and title of the federal rules, and that will always be at best just ambiguous enough for someone to say no to a project or freeze the whole machinery of a project. And if the requirements in new bills are not things that were included in the CARES Act, the states will then need to go back and build new programs to adapt to these new statutes, which loses all of the efficiencies and advantages of the programs that they built during the CARES Act period, and invites further delays as states build, check compliance, and wait for Treasury or other agency guidance. So if the goal is to get the relief out quickly and get infrastructure built in a way that helps folks in the near term, simpler is better. And so how do we communicate about it? I think the best way to communicate about it is to tell stories. And there's plenty coming out of the CARES Act funded broadband projects about really substantive wins. So as a final note, I want to point out that while many of the and unserved people in the CARES Act funded projects were in rural communities, there are significant challenges on access, affordability, and adoption in urban areas as well that would benefit from the flexibility of state block grant programs, and may fail to flag as unserved or underserved communities in federal data. And I don't think those communities should be overlooked. So hopefully we'll have a few minutes here for questions, and I'd be happy to do a little Q&A, Chip.
Thank you, Josh. And as I hopefully will come back up on the screen, or if you can hear me, we've been having great conversations with congressional, and we'll be having conversations with FCC commissioners throughout our policy summit. Let me see, hold on just a second.
No problem. I can hear you.
Yep.
And so
And we had a great session with Ed Markey, a senator from Massachusetts, a tremendous congressional leader on broadband and telecom and tech. I asked him yesterday, will there be an infrastructure bill? And in the infrastructure bill, will there be a major broadband component? And his answer was, is Tom Brady going to win the Super Bowl? You're asking me, a prediction that right now has strong bipartisan support and a consensus that we need to be able to connect every American to the internet. And then all the applications like your stories highlight that will connect educationally, in healthcare, and in commerce, in the ways that we really need as we've learned from COVID. So if we have a major component, and right now the House is starting with a $100 billion proposal by Jim Clyburn in the infrastructure broadband piece, how do you balance between traditional programs like the RDOF, USF, the E-rate program, telemedicine and telehealth, and then what we've just learned coming out of COVID and the block grant programs that you just highlighted? So what is that balance?
It's a really good.
How would you advocate or have us advocate as we go forward in the congressional session to get that balance right?
So it's a really good question, Chip, because there are many existing programs which are effective at getting broadband deployed year over year. There's some new programs where we're waiting to see what the efficacy will be, but we have high hopes. And we have some emerging models around what states can do when they have sort of unfettered access and broad discretion. And my view is that the answer is an all of the above approach. I think the monolithic nature of large federal programs provides for being able to move large quantities of subsidy against really hard and intractable problems. And that steady year-over-year support, whether it surges for 1 or 2 years or stays at a high level, is absolutely critical for solving this problem. And I think we should sustain the success in those programs and continue to tune them up iteratively. I also think we need to unleash the creativity at the state level and leverage the good work that states are doing to map and understand where there are and underserved customers, where areas lack competition, understanding the nuances between availability, affordability, and adoption, which are 3 different and really important levers that need funding. And so my view is we need to advocate for a large enough amount of support to sustain and increase the velocity of those ongoing federal programs, but also provide on a broad basis discretionary, federally funded but state implemented block grants.
As I look at your experience in the Army as a signal officer, I'm thinking of the combination of the military is a very large and many times bureaucratic organization and slow to move. Yet within it, it has units of the Navy SEALs or the Rangers, the units that can land quickly, establish a beachhead, and accomplish a mission on a very targeted and strategic basis. Basically, what you're advocating is that same thing, that the block grant allows us to move quickly in times of an emergency and a crisis caused by COVID to establish the needed coverage in those targeted areas of education and healthcare and economic recovery. And so I'm hopeful that we can take your lessons and the stories that Tilson has learned through this process and have that adopted in some form of all of the above that you just outlined. One last question. Many times our companies and the communities in which they're deploying broadband may have tensions or conflicts. So how do we win the hearts and the minds of all of the mayors and the local officials that have to give you the permits and with you on the rights of way and the other access to be able to deploy your networks? Is there a way that in the infrastructure bill that we can give resources and expertise and win over so that there's a collaborative relationship between our broadband companies deploying networks in the communities they serve, what is the right approach between speeding and streamlining deployment in a cooperative way with our cities and mayors and localities?
Chip, it's a simple question with a complex answer, and it's very near and dear to my heart. Most of our day job at Tilson is trying to secure those approvals in the rights of way for wireless and fiber. The good news is that the environment is different than it was a year ago. I think there's no community in America that doesn't appreciate the importance of broadband and what it means for people trying to access critical services like telehealth, distance education, and remote work. That being said, we're still running into challenges and resistance in places, and in particular, high costs. And those costs, ironically, in a subsidy environment, just shift the burden back to the public for those costs. And so, the first thing that I advocate for in legislation, what we could do to help here would be to make sure that costs for access are reasonable on a cost reimbursement basis. And this isn't viewed as a revenue source for those localities, except to cover their costs. And I think I think ultimately it's not in the public interest to subsidize broadband and have some of that subsidy wind up in some other use. I think secondly, the FCC has done really good work around setting clear expectations about the shot clock and other mechanisms around access at the community level. And I think at some level, we are now in the time period where the case law is working its way through the system to test those rules. And so I think what we'll find is those rules are quite helpful and effective. And so, the final piece that I would advocate for is looking back to our membership at INCOMPAS and other carriers in the broader telecom community, and encourage them to continue to demonstrate public benefit in these projects. And as they come into communities, to understand that the government in the local community is just a manifestation of the customers they hope to serve, and to be really clear about articulating the public benefit and making sure that if we're going to dig up the streets, that people understand why, and that we're communicating clearly about what we're going to do for that community, and to stretch and to try and find ways to deliver additional and incremental public benefit in that process.
Well, as you know, INCOMPAS earlier this year released and published the Broadband Blueprint. And a lot of that is addressing how do we get the best deployment practices at the local level, a collaborative relationship with the localities and our companies. And as we advocate for the infrastructure funding for broadband, we want to find a win-win where the resources for the cities and localities are made available to them to do the planning and the permitting and the technical designs and approvals that need to be done. But hopefully they would get a reward for adopting the best practices, the shot clocks, the timelines, the streamlining, and so that they can have the resources they need. They can give to our companies the certainty, the time certainty needed for the deployment of a very needed service right now, broadband to all Americans and to every community, rich or poor, rural or urban, so that the equity and the opportunity that we all hope for our country can be made available as quickly as possible through the broadband connections that our companies are providing. So I really appreciate what Tilson is doing around the country, the example and the powerful story that you can tell. And look forward to advocating on behalf of Tilson and our other companies through this Congress, and hopefully this is the transformational year that we reach a new commitment and consensus to connect every American.
Thanks, Chip. That's really well said.
Thank you, Josh, very much.